Dr. Jeanne Reames, and we are going to take on this time the old trope that Alexander went crazy with grief after the death of Hephaistion. And I did this kind of heading into Valentine's Day, which may seem at face value as a strange connection, but really is not, because we're considering Hephaistion's emotional importance to Alexander, and that this is part of why his grieving was the way it was. So quick answer, the sort of too long didn't read version of this is, did he go crazy with grief? No. Okay, no, he did not. Many years ago, I wrote an article, which I'll put in a link to in the notes, called The Mourning of Alexander the Great, that was kind of addressing this. And I'd seen over and over and over again in various books and such, descriptions of Alexander's mourning as if it was somehow abnormal. And I'd spend some time in bereavement work and in dealing with folks who were going through mourning, and I'm looking at what he's doing and going, this is not abnormal. Not for an intense loss. That this is actually quite normal and in what you would expect. What's different in Alexander's case was his wealth to spend on funerals, his power to have his wishes followed up. That was different, but not the expressions of a loss. These were things that I had seen in other folks who had lost somebody significant. And in bereavement work, the two hardest losses are the loss of a child and the loss of a spouse. Now, completely apart from whether or not Alexander and Hephaistion were lovers, and I do think they were, at least in their youth, Hephaistion's emotional significance to Alexander is that of a spouse, okay? That of your closest support person. And when we are looking at mourning, we must always consider what is a proper cultural expression. So what you think is normal mourning may not be what your buddy from a different cultural and background thinks is normal mourning. It may seem extreme to you, and it's not to someone from that particular culture. So there's that. Then we also have differences in emotional ties, and what can be interpreted in one place as significant for another group is going to be structured in another way. And when we are dealing with antiquity, marriage ties were not their closest bonds. These marriages are not often love matches. Sure, love can develop in an ancient marriage, but the closest ties that people tended to make were not infrequently to their own gender, regardless of whether or not they were lovers. Or, as I think for Alexander and Hephaistion, they were probably lovers in their youth, but not by the time they're in their 30s necessarily. That would have been a very odd arrangement. But emotionally, Alexander has risen to the pinnacle of power. Who can he trust the way that he trusts his childhood friend? Okay. And so when Hephaistion dies of some kind of febrile disease, the rug is yanked out from underneath Alexander. This is his most trusted friend, and he's dead. This is the person he could be himself with, who he characterizes as Philolexandros, okay, the friend of Alexander, not the friend of the king, the friend of Alexander, and he's dead. And that just kicks Alexander down the road. It's a huge loss. So it's like losing a spouse, and that's how we have to understand Alexander's mourning in this particular case. So in that, okay, again, looking at what is normal mourning, a lot of times folks watching other people mourn are not familiar with normal expressions or how long grief goes on. It takes an entire year just to get through the worst of it, to learn to live without this person. And we talk about stages of grief, You can also talk about tasks of grieving as well. But unless you're dealing with bereavement on a fairly regular basis, or you've been through it yourself, it may seem extreme. When my mother died, my dad's closest friend courted me like 3 months later in the kitchen and said, "I'm really worried about Ed. We went to dinner the other night, and something reminded him of Ida Lee, your mother, and he just broke down in tears, and I think he's not dealing well with this." And I was like, no, that's normal, Paul. Don't worry about it. That's perfectly normal at this stage. It's only been 3 months. And to him, that had seemed like not long, that it was way too long. But no. He was in the very depth of mourning. So you have, this initial shock phase that can be up to 2 weeks. It depends on whether the death is expected or not. And then you kind of move into this very, very deep mourning where you want to remember the person even as that memory is painful. You're working through this, through anger, through bargaining, through almost a clinical level of depression. And this goes in cycles. It's not linear, okay? And that can take up to about 8 months. Well, guess when Alexander died? He was probably just beginning to come out of that into this stage of grief where one reintegrates into the world, makes friends who didn't know the lost one. And that may have been about where he was in Babylon. He's getting ready for Hephaistion's funeral, etc. So he's getting to a point where we're moving toward integration, but he's not there. Okay, so what we're seeing in the sources that are being described is the kind of depths of grief in his last 8-9 months of life after Hephaestion passes. So this is how to kind of think about and understand that. That's normal. This is normal mourning. It takes that long. Yes, it really does. Furthermore, Macedonia, compared to, say, South Greece, appears to have been a more emotionally expressive culture. So the way the Greeks are talking about Alexander's mourning isn't necessarily the way that is perceived by fellow Macedonians, and we don't have Macedonian sources. Okay, so this is a big block. Furthermore, when you're dealing with Romans, that's a step even further. And Alexander becomes, for some Roman authors, this negative exemplar that I've talked about, that this is what not to do. So Seneca talks about Alexander's inability to control his emotions because of his rages and his grief. Okay, he is not expressing what might have been conceived of as normal. So even when we're dealing with our ancient sources, we have to be very careful because we're still not hearing about Alexander's expressions from a Macedonian source, right? So that's my cautions when it comes to assessing Alexander's mourning behavior. Now, in this article, I did write and collect the descriptions, and I said I'm not going to try to evaluate which ones I think are true, actually happened, versus those that are later exaggerations, and we know some of them almost certainly are. Even Arian, who lists them, Arian lists them fairly completely for us. He says, well, there's some of these I don't think they actually happened, but I'm going to tell them to you anyway. And so that's kind of what I've done as well. And so I'm going to read for you these 17 different or not accounts, but things that are attributed to Alexander's mourning. And then we're going to take a look at, I'm not going to go through all of them because one time I don't want to, we would be here until the cows come home. And I already did that in that article, so you can go and read it. But I'm going to talk about these in the context, evaluate them for possible pathological grieving or mourning behaviors, as at the time the DSM-3, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, at the point I was writing this, it was the 3R. Now we're up, I think, to 5. But I've got them listed in there from that. And whether or not you could diagnose a pathological form of mourning. Pathological just means not a standard, not a normal one. There are 4 different possibilities. Distorted, it can be either the anger or the guilt type. In Alexander's case, it's not the guilt type, it would be the anger type. Conflicted mourning, severe, again, as opposed to normal but intense and chronic. So those will be the four I'll mention. And I'm not going to go into detail about them. But first, I want to list out the actions attributed to Alexander and what it says here. So first of all, we are told, and many of these are coming from Arrian, and if you want to go read it for yourself, it's Arrian, Book 7, Chapter 14. And he lists them. The rest are from, or most of the others are from Plutarch's Life of Alexander, chapter 72. Okay. Plutarch's is not nearly as complete as Arrian's. Plutarch is more inclined to the more extreme versions. So, Arrian says, weeping prostrate on the body till carried away by his officers. And he says the duration is given variously as the greater part of a day or a day and a night. 2, retiring for 2 days to his rooms, during which he fasted and did not see to personal hygiene. Okay. Those are both Arrian. Arrian also says having the doctor Glaucus executed for malpractice, either by hanging, which is what Arrian says, or by crucifixion, according to Plutarch. 4, cutting his hair and lying on the body. Okay, Arrian. Having the manes and tails of the horses and mules shorn. That's from Plutarch. Removing battlements from nearby cities. That is also from Plutarch. Okay. Ordering general mourning, which included, according to Plutarch, a ban on music, particularly flute music. And again, Plutarch gives that. Arrian talks about ordering this general mourning. He doesn't give much in the way of specifics. One account, Arrian says that one of them was ordering the temple of Asclepius in Ecbatana to be raised. Arrian doubts that. I do think historiographically there's good reason maybe not to believe that. Arrian does give the alternative that when met by an envoy from Epidaurus while on the road to Babylon, he sent back an offering for Asclepius with the comment, however, Asclepius has not shown kindness to me, failing to save my comrade, whom I valued as much as my own head. Okay. And as I've said before, I'm always a little bit dubious when we're hearing the words of Alexander. But there might be some remnants there of something he said, of that as much as my own head. This is something you hear a lot from mourning persons. They talk about the dead loved one like a body part. 10, he says, sending an envoy to Ammon asking if he might sacrifice to Hephaistion as to a god, to which the oracle replied, no, but you are allowed to give him the honors due to a hero. And we get this from Arrian and Plutarch as well. Conducting a war against the Cassians as an outlet for grief, in which the dead are called a sacrifice, a geras, to Hephaistion's shade. Plutarch talks about this. Driving the funeral cart himself on the road to Babylon. Arrian says this. He says he doubts that occurred. While preparing for the funeral, this is 13, he ordered the sacred fire to be put out until the funeral was over, a custom normally reserved only for Persian kings. This is in Diodorus 17, Book 17, chapter 114. We don't get a lot about this from Diodorus because there's lost parts in there, but it's from Diodorus we get this incredible description of Hephaistion's funeral pyre, and he describes it in detail, but there's not a lot about Alexander's mourning in there. And again, in Curtius we have nothing because there's this huge lacuna. 14, never appointing replacement to Hephaistion's chiliarchy, although Perdiccas effectively functions in that role, and retaining his name and his banner, Hephaistion's, for his own hipparchy of the companion cavalry as a memorial. So that's in Arrian. Arrian also says, 15, that Alexander ordered games to be held in Hephaistion's honor for the funeral held in Babylon. It doesn't seem these actually took place, but the people were still around when Alexander himself died shortly after. Okay. 16, spending either 10 or 12,000 talents on an elaborate funeral. Arrian says 10,000. Diodorus says it was 12,000. So does Justin. Just a reminder, that's a heck of a lot of money. That's up in the millions on a funeral, but Alexander was the richest man in the world. So he had it to spend. And 17, sending an order to Cleomenes in Alexandria for the construction of a sumptuous hero shrine on the Isle of Pharos, and for Hephaestion's name to be used in mercantile contracts, apparently as a patron for traders. He guaranteed a pardon to Cleomenes on both past and future offenses if Alexander was satisfied with the job that was done when he returned to Egypt. That is also found in Arrian. Okay. Cleomenes was, this is kind of a horrible thing, as Cleomenes was a bit of a monster in how he treated the Egyptians. So these are once reported as Alexander's mourning. Now, as I said, let's take a look at these compared to the symptoms listed in the DSM-3R and I'm going to look specifically at distorted grief of the anger type and then at severe grief. We can pretty much eliminate conflicted grief. Conflicted grief's expression is usually a delay in the expression of grief, as there, it's kind of often kind of a love-hate relationship with the deceased person, and it just does not apply at all in Alexander's case. The problem with trying to diagnose whether it would have been chronic grief is that grief never really resolves. It just keeps going like an open wound. And Alexander died 8 months later. He doesn't even get through the first year of grief. So we really can't look at that. But we can look at distorted grief. We can look at severe grief. And I did so. So in here, the symptoms listed was overactivity without a sense of loss. No. Okay. Maybe overactivity, but definitely a sense of loss. Acquisition of the symptoms belonging to the last illness of the deceased. Kinda, except it was a real disease. Alexander died of some sort of fever disease, again, about 8-9 months later. 3, recognized medical disease of a psychosomatic nature. Unknown, probably not. Conspicuous alteration in relationships to living friends and relatives. Not to an unexpected degree that we can tell. Once more, the sources can be iffy. All of these are discussed in greater detail in the article itself. Furious hostility against specific persons. Yes, the physician who he accuses of malpractice, essentially, and Asclepius himself, the god of mourning. Wooden or formal appearances with an affect, expressions, and conduct resembling schizophrenic pictures. No, apparently not. Lasting loss of patterns of social interaction. No. Actions detrimental to his own social and economic existence. Again, not really. Okay. Clinical agitated depression. We don't have enough evidence to give really a conclusion there. Unknown has to be the thing. So again, when you're looking at diagnosing things, it can't just be like one thing. You need most of them, or at least the majority of them, and that's just not there. So I think we can say distorted grief of the anger variety. No, it doesn't really apply. So let's then turn to severe grief. Sudden death with severe grief. Psychotic symptoms including obsessive compulsive neuroses, hysteria, manic depressive psychoses, anxiety, or schizoid state. Again, not so far as we can determine. Prominent denial of the loss. Definitely not. Conflict between an intellectual acceptance of the death and full acceptance. It's hard to evaluate again from our evidence, but there doesn't appear to have been one. Extreme manifestation of bewilderment, anxiety, self-reproach, or depression, which render the bereaved unable to function in any area of life. Again, no. He's still functioning as king. Grief symptoms that persist much longer than typical. Unable to really be determined again because Alexander died too soon. And a loss of confidence in the fairness of life, which manifests as extreme cynicism or anger and may lead to self-destructive behaviors or violence toward others. Unknown. Maybe some hints of a few things, but it's not really strongly indicated. So once more, we're looking at, we can tick a couple boxes here, but there's just not enough. And once more, when you're looking at Alexander's behavior there toward the end of his life, he seems to be coming out of the second phase, moving into the third phase, which is acceptance of the death, in starting to make ties of people who maybe didn't know Hephaistion very well, or were not part of that inner circle. So yeah, he seems to be recovering. Okay. And once more, we have to take what he's doing in the context of the richest, most powerful man in the world. And so he can impose the grief he's feeling on others, and do these expressions of grief that strike folks as extreme until you figure in he's the richest man living, etc. So understanding all of that, and understanding Alexander's mourning as for a person who functioned as a spouse in his life, his emotional grounding, his emotional other, who he loved as it was as dear to him as his own head, if those are indeed his words, then no, Alexander's mourning was not atypical at all. It followed a regular pattern. It is more or less what we would expect for the time period that had passed, and he did not go crazy with grief. He mourned in a normal fashion for someone who was that close to him. Thank you. We'll take something else next time, but that, as I said, is maybe a Valentine-ish, a depressed Valentine description for this time of the year.